Hello, my name is John Kwiatkowski. I'm retired now, but when I was working, I was a science and operations officer at the National Weather Service in Indianapolis. While I was there, I did a series of presentations on how weather and climate affected human history. One was about how climate change helped bring about the rise of ancient Egyptian civilization. It was popular with my staff, so I put it on YouTube, hoping people like you would enjoy it too. Full disclosure, you'll hear my own voice only on this and the closing slide. To avoid a lot of us and does, for the other slides, I use a synthetic speech engine. The engine is provided by the Poly feature of Amazon Web Services and uses the Matthew voice.
Our story takes place in the Nile Valley. As most of you know, the Nile is the longest river in the world. It originates at Lake Victoria in the Central African highlands, flows north for more than 4,000 miles and finally enters the sea in Egypt. Most of our story will take place along the lower course of the river, as indicated by the red arrow. Climatology along the course of the Nile varies greatly. In Egypt itself, there is almost no rainfall, except around 7 inches per year near the Mediterranean Sea. On the other hand, there is an average of 80 inches of rain annually at the river's headwaters at Lake Victoria. Total rainfall there can vary from one year to the next, but the timing is extremely regular because it depends on the seasonal course of the sun. Hydroclimatology refers to the climate of rivers. The Nile River's hydroclimatology before the Aswan Dam was built was flooding in Egypt from July to November as the rain that fell in the Lake Victoria region moved downstream. The flooding removed salts that had accumulated in the soil and deposited a fertile layer of silt. It also provided a lot of water that could be trapped and used later for irrigation. The result was farming was easy. However, in geologic terms, this was a very recent development. If you visited what would become Egypt 10,000 years ago, you would have found things very different from the way they are now. The area got about 10 to 20 inches of rain a year, mainly in the summer as tropical moisture moved in. The result was that where desert currently prevails, there was a grassland, or to use the African term, a savanna. The people who would become the Egyptians resided in the region, making their living as nomadic cattle raisers. You can get an idea of how they lived by watching things like National Geographic videos about people in the so-called Sahel area of Africa. In those days, the Nile Valley was almost uninhabited. In the more humid climate, it was very swampy and prone to wild floods. You could never be sure what would be next to the river one year and beneath it the next. However, although people didn't live there permanently, they did visit the valley to gather wild grains and other foodstuffs. One thing about getting 15 or so inches of rain yearly is it doesn't leave much margin for error. Here in Indianapolis we get 44 inches of rain annually. If we're off by 5 inches, that's only about 10% and it usually doesn't make much difference. 5 inches in a 15-inch per year climate can be a killer since grass needs at least 10 inches of rain a season to grow well. These people needed a way to ensure they got enough moisture when they needed it. The way they handled the problem was they developed a profession called the rainmaker. In other societies, such a person might be described as a shaman or witch doctor, but rainmaker is the term used by people who study this place and time. These rainmakers didn't actually make the rain fall. Instead, their job was to get the gods to make it fall. They were really knowledge workers who knew the latest and greatest methods of persuading the gods. Now it might sound like these rainmakers were really a bunch of charlatans, but it's worth pointing out they were held to a higher standard of accountability than National Weather Service employees are today. Which is to say, if anything went wrong, the rainmaker was sent to meet the god of the dead. That is, if he couldn't do the job, he was sacrificed and they got someone who could. The system worked okay until about 5000 BC, when the climate changed in a big way. Rainfall in Egypt declined to about the same as it is today. That meant no grass would grow as the Sahara Desert developed. People had to adapt to survive in the new situation. One thing they had going for them was that in the drier climate the Nile floods became less severe, which meant the river channel stayed in about the same place from year to year. They started moving close to the Nile to take advantage of the wild grains growing there, which soon became the main food source. With time they began deliberately cultivating those grains, thereby inventing agriculture. That innovation was accompanied by the appearance of villages and primitive irrigation systems. As all this happened, the rainmakers had to make some adjustments too. You might think they would just disappear. However, What actually happened is they became river makers. That is, it became their job to make sure the Nile flooded properly. Note the term river makers isn't something you will see anywhere else. It's just something I use for convenience in this presentation. One thing these guys had going for them was the stage of the river wasn't too critical. As long as the population was low, enough land flooded every season to grow enough grain to feed everyone. On the other hand, timing was critical, for planting reasons. It so happens our river makers were very adept at this. If you didn't know better, you'd think some sort of natural process upstream controlled when the river flooded. Now you might think these river makers were a bunch of con men. However, I would argue that, within their own place and time, they were more akin to science officers in the National Weather Service today. A modern-day science officer is expected to use the latest, best knowledge they have about nature for the benefit of their people. And that's exactly what these river makers were doing. It's worth pointing out that it wasn't so easy to prove that what these guys were doing didn't work. They couldn't just say, well, maybe this is just a waste of time. Maybe nobody can affect the river. Why not knock off the river making ceremonies for a year and see what happens? It's not like the world is going to come to an end if we're wrong, is it? Unfortunately, it was true. The world was going to come to an end if they were wrong. They weren't in a good position to experiment. Having said that, it is likely they had some genuine skill in forecasting what the Nile would do. After all, they still had that sacrifice incentive to get good results. While we don't know for sure how the river makers made their forecasts, here are some tools they had available to them and comparable tools the Weather Service uses today. It's extremely likely they used astronomy. A certain star rising in a certain place at a certain time could be an excellent indicator of what season it was and what the river could be expected to do next. Today's Weather Service uses what amounts to astronomy by using different equations for different seasons. Wind patterns over Egypt change from one season to the next, and while it's sunny a lot, some times of the year are cloudier than others. By comparing what they observed to what was typical, it may have been possible to make inferences about what was going on upstream. If they did use such methods, they were in good keeping with today's weather service. Seasonal hurricane forecasts, for example, are partially based on comparing observed sea surface temperatures to climatological norms. There's no question they used magic rituals. An elaborate ceremony just made things look more impressive and convincing. And, although you might be surprised to hear it, the Weather Service is heavily into this. Great efforts are put into giving products a professional-looking appearance, which causes people to have more confidence in them. However, a forecast portrayed using the latest AI techniques isn't inherently any better than one drawn with crayons. To the extent you think it is, you're just reacting to magic. Of course, in fairness to the Weather Service, it's far from the only organization to use magic this way. How many people can you think of who put a lot of emphasis on appearance to build credibility? They had another tool which may seem obvious. They could just go down and look at the river. However, this was trickier than it may seem at first. The Nile crocodile, which was a god to them, was a very common and very dangerous animal. Going down to the Nile took a little more dedication than just strolling over to check a rain gauge. No matter how they did it, things worked out well for the river makers. The floods remained regular enough to reliably grow crops. With a good food supply, the population increased. Small villages grew into cities. Little countries appeared. Irrigation systems became more complicated. That resulted in stronger governments to improve coordination. Since they were the ones who ensured everything worked, the river makers were the logical ones to put in charge. Over time they accumulated more and more duties. For instance, it became their responsibility to ensure the sun rose on time. Now they've reached the top. Now they're gods and they're kings. Now they rule the entire country of Egypt. In fact, it was the first nation-state in history. There's been another upgrade to their responsibilities too. Now it's their duty to maintain something called Ma'at, which is the eternal balance of the universe. River-making becomes subsumed under this. There's one thing you have to like about these guys. They don't forget where they came from. Now that they're in charge, human sacrifice is gone. Not just for them, but for everyone. The system worked well until roughly 2000 BC when complications arose. The population had been growing, so the height of the flood, not just the timing, became more important. With more people, There was no guarantee enough land would be flooded each year to produce sufficient grain to feed everybody. This made irrigation issues more complex. Decisions had to be made about how a limited amount of water could be allocated, a process called routing. It became a political necessity for Pharaoh to know what the height of the flood would be. To address this need, the Egyptians invented the science of hydrology. The first step was to locate some institution as far upstream as possible. The goal was to find something permanently staffed, such as a temple or a fort. Some of these places were more than 1,000 miles upriver from the capital. Once the desired institution was selected, the next step was to have someone take observations of the height of the river. This was done simply by using a staff with marks on it. A complicating factor was that places far upstream tended to be frontier areas, which meant there could still be plenty of Nile crocodiles, or as they would have put it, manifestations of the god Sobek. There's no way to be certain, but presumably the lowest-ranking person was usually designated the observer. Given the observation had been taken, it had to be processed. This was done using one of the latest, most advanced technologies available: writing. This would be done by somebody such as a priest, army officer, or scribe. That is, somebody literate. By using cutting-edge technology to advance the river forecasting process, they did exactly what a modern-day hydrologist does. These people can be considered the hydrologists of their era. Here is what some of their output looked like. What you're seeing here is the word for Nile in hieroglyphs. It was pronounced happy. The Egyptians believed the river was a goddess by that name. Just as a matter of interest, the name of the river could also be written this way. In ancient Egyptian, whether you read right to left or left to right depends on the context. Just as weather service hydrologists today are middle class, so were the hydrologists of ancient Egypt. Here is what one such person and his wife would have looked like. These people were called Rahotep and Nofret. You can visit them today in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Although this couple was from the royal family, the way they dressed would be typical of middle-class Egyptians. In case you're wondering what these ancient hydrologists got paid, based on records of the time it would have been something like what you see here. These figures are actually for a mid-ranking public official. Some land, which technically belonged to Pharaoh, to grow crops on, and from the royal stores, 2 cattle, 2 bolts of cloth, and 2 barrels of beer yearly. I don't know how big the beer barrels were, but I suppose if they had been large enough, nothing else would have mattered. Given the observation had been taken and processed, it was sent to the people who would use it. That would include Pharaoh, in person. Other high-ranking officials would see it too. Once they had it, they used a technique called routing to predict what the river would do. Routing is based on the principle if you know what is happening upstream, which is exactly what the observation would tell them, you can forecast what will happen downstream when the water from the observation point arrives. After they figured out what the river was going to do in Egypt, they could make decisions about how water should be allocated and predict how good the harvest would be. When they used routing, they used a technique that is still used by the National Weather Service to this day. Of course, modern-day hydrologists usually have to go above and beyond simple routing to make good forecasts. Unlike most river forecasters today, the Egyptians didn't have to account for the effects of tributaries or precipitation. Starting in the year 664 BC, big changes came to Egypt. They attacked, and then were conquered by, the neighboring Assyrian Empire. Eventually the Assyrians left, but after that there were other conquerors. Egypt's great days as a nation were over. However, no matter who was running the country, the program of forecasting the Nile flood stayed the same. It didn't matter if you were a king or a provincial governor, it was in your interest to know how much water there would be and what the harvest would be like. In fact, their methods of monitoring the river became even more sophisticated. They invented something called the Nileometer. This is a picture of one located near the Aswan Dam. Although you can't quite see it in the picture, the steps were open to the river. All they had to do to measure the height of the river was to observe what step the water was at. Also, note that no crocodile could get over the walls. Today's National Weather Service uses what we call stage forms to relate the height of a river to what consequences there will be. The ancient Egyptians had a stage form of their own. The information on this slide was taken from the Roman historian Pliny. It compares the height of the seasonal flood crest at the observation point to what could be expected downstream. If the river crested at 18 feet at the Nileometer, Not enough water would make it downstream to fulfill irrigation needs and they could expect famine. A crest of 21 feet meant a decent harvest that year. If the Nile made it to 23 feet, the Egyptians would be thrilled because the harvest would be extra large. On the other hand, if the river rose all the way to 27 feet, that meant disaster. The flood would be so high it would take the water a long time to recede and force planting to be later than optimal. Starting around 200 AD, more changes came to Egypt. Christianity arrived, followed by Islam. The Roman Empire collapsed, and there were other problems. While the process of monitoring the Nile didn't completely end, it was partially disrupted in all the chaos. Even so, there must always have been local experts who could tell their fellow villagers something about what the river was doing. However, they would not have claimed they had any divine power over it. Claiming such powers would have been a big mistake in a Christian or Islamic society. Finally, it all came to an end in the 1960s when the construction of the Aswan Dam and Lake Nasser ended the seasonal flooding of the Nile entirely. However, no dam lasts forever. Someday we shall see what we shall see. We're almost at the end of the presentation now, but before we close, I'd like to propose a few things for you to think about. I'm going to assume if you're viewing this, you can write. That means you're using a modified version of a technology that was developed long ago by the Egyptians. And they got started on the road to civilization when North Africa dried out and changed from a grassland to a desert. To get a little more serious about the matter, it's worth pointing a few things out. Climate change is an extraordinarily complicated phenomenon. It's no exaggeration to say that to the people living there, North Africa turning into a desert ended the world as they knew it. They could never have imagined that the end result would be that they'd create a civilization that still influences us today. We should be ready for climate change to have many consequences we can't foresee now. Some may even be benign. Here's another thing to think about. People just assumed a man, at least if he was working with the gods, could get the Nile River to go up and down for thousands of years. They would have no more doubted it than you would doubt the reality of World War II. So what do you know? What do you know as certainly as your own name that people will laugh at in 5,000 years?
Well, I'm back to my own voice for the end of the presentation here. I hope you enjoyed it, and I appreciate your watching it. There are actually two more slides after this one. The first one deals with credits for the show, and the second one is sources of more information if you'd like to follow up on any of this. Thanks again.